Picture this. You're living in a typical neighborhood. Kids are out playing neighbors, chatting over fences, just an average day.
Uh-huh.
But under the surface, in this seemingly peaceful place, a truly horrifying secret is hidden. Today, we're going deep into the case of Fred and Rose West,
Yes,
one of Britain's most notorious killer couples.
absolutely.
Their crimes truly shocked the nation and revealed the dark side hidden beneath a very normal appearance.
Yeah, it's a case that still fascinates and horrifies people, even all these years later. We're going to look at the twisted path they took to become the monsters they were,
Right.
exploring their past, their psychology, and the chilling details of their crimes.
And we'll try to figure out how these seemingly average people living in a seemingly average house
Right,
could do such terrible things. We've got a lot to unpack.
we do.
So let's start from the beginning. What about Fred West's childhood? What kind of environment did he come from?
Well, Fred West was born back in 1941 into a poor farming family in Herefordshire, England. One of 8 children, his early years were marked by poverty, a really harsh and controlling father,
Wow.
and according to Fred himself, a disturbingly close relationship with his mother.
Those claims about his mother, they're pretty unsettling. He said that she abused him sexually from a very young age, even teaching him to have sex with animals. How do we sort out these claims, considering his tendency to manipulate?
That's the tough part of this case. Fred was a known liar, so separating truth from fiction is really difficult. We have to be pretty skeptical about his statements.
Yeah.
However, even if we don't accept the specifics, it's clear that his family was incredibly messed up
Right.
and very likely play a big part in shaping his later behavior.
So a troubled childhood, a volatile family situation, those are common threads we see in the backgrounds of many criminals.
Yes,
Were there any early warning signs, any hints of what was to come?
definitely. Even as a kid, Fred showed some troubling behavior.
Like what?
He was aggressive toward girls not interested in school,
Right.
and he got involved in petty theft, all signs of ignoring rules and social norms.
Those are real red flags.
Yeah.
The kind of things that would make you think twice about letting your kids hang out at their house.
Precisely. And these behaviors actually got worse after he had a bad motorcycle accident when he was a teenager.
I see.
He had some serious head injuries. People who knew him noticed some real personality changes. He became even more aggressive, impulsive, and prone to violent outbursts.
So we're seeing a troubled upbringing, potential brain trauma, and a total disregard for boundaries.
Yes.
It's like a recipe for disaster,
Yeah.
paving the way for a descent into darkness.
It certainly set the stage for what he would become, and we see this volatile nature showing up in his early relationships too, especially with a young woman named Rena.
Rena, right? Their relationship seemed rocky from the start, full of abuse and control.
Huh.
And then there's the whole complicated situation with their first child, Charmaine.
Yes, Fred really tried to hide Charmaine's real father.
Really?
Her biological dad was Asian, and Fred, being racist, made up a story about adopting her to cover it up.
Wow, that's awful prejudice against his own daughter. And meanwhile, he's showering his biological daughter, Anne Marie, with affection,
Right.
creating this disturbing pattern of favoritism and cruelty within the family.
It's a pattern we see throughout his life, a mix of selective affection with brutal indifference and violence. And this whole thing becomes even more complex when Anna McFall comes into the picture.
Right.
She was originally hired as a nanny for the kids.
Anna McFall, who tragically disappeared while pregnant with Fred's child.
Yes.
Her remains were later found buried in a field.
Right.
A truly chilling foreshadowing of the horrors to come. It's hard to understand how anyone could get caught up in this web of lies and violence.
And yet that's exactly what happened. Fred's ability to manipulate people, his charm and control drew people into his world, often with terrible results.
It's around this time that another major player enters the picture, Rose Letts, who later becomes Rose West.
Right.
Their meeting, as I understand it, happened in a pretty seedy place.
That's right. They met at the Poppin' Cafe, a place known for being a hangout for the shadier side of Gloucester. It was a spot where stolen goods were traded, pornography was around, and the people there were, well, let's just say not the most reputable.
It's almost like a symbol of the darkness that was pulling them together.
It is a striking image, for sure. And their relationship moved pretty quickly despite the big age difference.
Okay.
Rose was only 15 when she met Fred, who was in his late 20s.
So a young and vulnerable woman drawn into the world of a manipulative and increasingly violent older man. It's a sad pattern we see way too often.
It is.
And as we've learned, Rose's role in this whole thing was far from passive.
Definitely. She wasn't just a bystander or a victim of Fred's manipulation.
Mhm.
The evidence we have, including testimonies from survivors,
Right.
paints a very disturbing picture of Rose as an active and willing participant in the abuse and violence that happened in that house.
So we have Fred, a product of a dysfunctional childhood,
Yes.
haunted by his own demons, and now Rose, a young woman who seemed to be seduced by the darkness he embodied.
Yes.
Together, they created a nightmare that would haunt their community and the entire nation for years.
They did. And this nightmare would reach its full terrifying potential at 25 Cromwell Street, a seemingly ordinary house that would become a tomb for many innocent victims.
Right.
But before we dive into the horrors of that house, let's think for a minute about the dynamics of this killer couple.
Okay.
What drives two people to join forces in such a horrifying partnership? It's a fascinating and disturbing question.
It is. We'll explore that right after this.
It's a question that's really puzzled experts for a long time. What makes a killer couple?
Yeah.
Often there's this shared feeling of power and control.
Right.
You know, a
Sure.
bond that comes from their shared cruelty and wanting to hurt others.
Right.
In the case of Fred and Rose, it seems like their relationship actually made their darkest urges even stronger,
Wow.
creating this horrifying kind of team of evil.
It's a disturbing thought. And this leads us to 25 Cromwell Street,
Yes.
the house that became the center of their reign of terror.
It did?
From the outside, it looked like any other house on a normal street.
Right.
But inside those walls, a horrifying reality was unfolding.
Yes. 25 Cromwell Street became their hunting ground, a place where they could live out their depraved fantasies and control their victims completely. It's also where they raised their children, exposing them to a level of depravity that's really hard to grasp.
The children. It's heartbreaking to think about what they went through.
It is.
Living in that house, surrounded by violence and abuse, always threatened with becoming another victim.
The things those children experienced at 25 Cromwell Street are truly disturbing.
Yeah.
They were physically and sexually abused, forced to take part in their parents' twisted games, and constantly reminded of what would happen if they disobeyed.
There's one detail that really stuck with me from the material we've been looking at. The children were often threatened with being buried like Heather,
Yes.
Fred's daughter from a previous relationship, who tragically became one of their victims.
It's a horrifying example of the mental torture they lived with.
Right.
Constant fear and uncertainty, the sense of betrayal those children must have felt.
It's almost impossible to imagine.
It is.
And to make things even more complex, Fred had peepholes installed throughout the house so he could spy on Rose and their victims.
Yes, the peepholes show Fred's voyeuristic tendencies
Okay.
and his need to have absolute control. He wanted to be watching everything, controlling everyone around him.
And what about Rose's role in all of this? Was she just a pawn in Fred's game, or did she actively participate in the abuse?
The evidence suggests that Rose was much more than just a passive bystander.
Okay.
She was actively involved in the torture and murder of their victims, often taking the lead in the abuse.
It's difficult to understand how a woman could be capable of such cruelty,
It is.
especially towards young girls, many of whom were around the same age as her own daughters.
It's a question that continues to baffle people who study this case.
Yeah.
Some believe that Rose was drawn to Fred's darkness, that she felt powerful and validated by taking part in his crimes.
A twisted kind of love story, I guess.
You could say that.
But their reign of terror couldn't go on forever.
Right.
How did their crimes finally come to light?
The beginning of the end came in 1994 when a social worker concerned about one of the West children filed a child abuse complaint.
Okay.
What started as a routine investigation quickly revealed the horrifying truth about what was going on at 25 Cromwell Street.
And what did the police find when they started digging deeper?
What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror.
Oh, wow.
9 bodies were discovered buried in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street,
Really?
including the remains of Heather West and other young women who had disappeared over the years.
It must have been a huge shock to the community and the entire country.
It was.
This seemingly ordinary house in a seemingly ordinary neighborhood turned into a symbol of pure evil.
Yes, the case captivated the public, fueled by the gruesome details and the sheer scale of the crimes.
Right.
The media called 25 Cromwell Street the House of Horrors,
Wow.
a name that would forever be linked to the West's reign of terror.
And what about Fred and Rose? How did they react when the truth was finally exposed?
When faced with overwhelming evidence, Fred confessed to some of the murders, trying to control the narrative even though his downfall was imminent.
Right.
However, in a final act of cowardice, he killed himself in prison before facing a full trial.
So he denied the victims and their families The justice of seeing him held accountable for his crimes.
That's right. And that left Rose to face the consequences alone. Her trial became a huge media event.
I can imagine.
The nation was captivated by the unfolding drama.
And how did Rose try to defend herself against the charges? Did she admit to her role in the crimes, or did she maintain her innocence?
At first, Rose tried to paint herself as a victim, claiming she was manipulated by Fred and forced to participate in his horrific acts.
But surely the evidence against her was overwhelming. Could she really convince anyone that she was just an innocent bystander?
In the end, the jury didn't believe her claims.
Okay.
They found her guilty on 10 counts of murder and sentenced her to a whole life tariff,
Wow.
meaning she'll spend the rest of her life in prison.
A small measure of justice for the victims and their families, even though nothing can truly erase the pain and suffering they endured.
Right.
But what about the West children? They were victims too.
Yes, they were.
Forced to live in that house of horrors, subjected to unspeakable abuse. What happened to them after their parents were arrested and convicted?
Their stories are complicated and heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Some of them have spoken out about what they went through, trying to reclaim their lives and heal from the trauma they endured. Others have chosen to stay silent,
I see.
trying to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of their parents' crimes.
It's a stark reminder that the effects of abuse can last a lifetime, impacting not just the immediate victims, but generations to come.
They can.
But before we delve further into the lasting impact of the West case, there's something that's been on my mind throughout this discussion. The sources we've reviewed suggest there was a gap of several years in their known murders.
Yeah.
Is it possible there were more victims out there?
That's possible.
Their stories still untold?
It's a question that haunts a lot of people who followed this case. Given the nature of their crimes and their apparent need to kill, it's certainly possible that there are more victims out there whose remains haven't been found. The full extent of their evil may never be fully known.
It's a chilling thought. More victims out there, perhaps? Their stories lost to time? But even for the ones we know about, the families left behind, the trauma continues.
It does.
And the West children their lives forever marked by the horrors they saw and experienced. I think their stories offer a really important way to understand the lasting impact of this whole thing.
I agree. The children's experiences are a stark reminder of just how insidious and pervasive abuse can be.
Right.
Especially within a family home.
You'd think that would be the safest place.
You would, but imagine growing up surrounded by violence, manipulation, and constant fear. The very people who are supposed to be protecting you are the ones causing the terror.
It's just beyond comprehension for most of us. But for the West children, this was their everyday life. We know some of them actually defended their parents even after the horrible discoveries at 25 Cromwell Street. How is that even possible?
Yeah.
How can children reconcile such unbelievable cruelty with the idea of their parents as caregivers?
It's complicated, but it's something we see a lot in cases of abuse,
I see.
especially when it goes on for a long time and starts young. These children were essentially brainwashed, their view of the world totally distorted by years of manipulation and fear.
Wow.
They were taught not to trust anyone outside the family, to believe that their parents, despite everything, were the only ones they could count on.
It shows how powerful manipulation can be, the way abusers can twist reality and control the story even within their own families. And it makes healing and recovery that much harder for these children.
Exactly. The trauma they went through goes so deep, affecting how they see themselves, their ability to trust, and their relationships with everyone. Some of them have spoken publicly about their experiences, wanting to take back their stories and find healing by sharing what happened. Others have chosen to stay silent, maybe still wrestling with all that happened in their past.
It's a reminder that there's no one right way to heal from trauma. Everyone's journey is different, shaped by their experiences and how they cope. But no matter what path they choose, it's so important that we offer support and try to understand just how long-lasting the effects of abuse can be.
I completely agree. The West case, as awful as it is, gives us valuable lessons about the nature of evil, how insidious abuse can be, and the importance of being vigilant and intervening early.
What are some of the key things you hope people listening will take away from this?
Well, first, I hope it reminds everyone that monsters don't always hide in the dark. They can be our neighbors, co-workers, even our own family members. Fred and Rose West seemed totally normal to the outside world, but behind closed doors, they were committing terrible acts. This case really highlights how important it is to question what we think we know and to look for warning signs even in ordinary situations.
It's easy to think things like this only happen somewhere else to other people. But the West case shows us that evil can be anywhere.
Exactly. And that leads to another really important point, speaking up.
Okay.
If you see something that doesn't seem right, if a child's behavior or a family dynamic worries, you don't wait to report it. You don't have to have absolute proof.
Yeah.
Just a phone call could potentially save a life.
It's easy to think it's not our business to get involved, to worry about overreacting.
Mm.
But as we've seen here, the consequences of staying silent could be devastating.
They can.
Hmm.
And lastly, I hope this has shown how damaging and long-lasting abuse can be, especially for children. The trauma from those early years can affect their whole lives, shaping their relationships, how they feel about themselves, their ability to trust.
Absolutely. It's a sobering reminder that the impact of abuse can echo through generations, affecting not just the victims, but their families and communities too.
It's so important that we offer support and understanding to those who've survived abuse, knowing that healing takes time and is a journey, not a quick fix. There are resources out there, groups that offer counseling, therapy, and support to help survivors.
And to everyone listening, if anything in this deep dive has affected you, if it's raised concerns or questions, please reach out to those resources. We'll include links to some helpful organizations in the show notes. Remember, knowledge is power.
Yes, it is.
By understanding the warning signs of abuse, how manipulation works, and the importance of early intervention, we can all help create a safer world.
Absolutely. The West case is a truly dark part of human history, but it also teaches us important lessons that can empower us to recognize and confront evil.
Well said. This wraps up our deep dive into the horrifying case of Fred and Rose West. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay vigilant.